Henry II of England and his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, have created and ruled the Plantagenet Empire, the most dynamic, wealthiest, and most powerful kingdom in Western Europe. But the Plantagenets are rarely at peace, and Henry's temper and ego has long troubled his family and his people, from the shocking martyrdom of Thomas Becket to the vicious Great Rebellion that saw Eleanor sent to prison for 15 years. Meanwhile, their brilliant, avaricious, rebellious children have grown, fought, ruled, married, and even died, so that of his 5 sons, only 2 survive, Richard Lionheart and John Lackland. Now, as the 12th century enters its final decade, Henry himself dies, leaving his great legacy poised at the edge of great success or great failure. Here's the story of what happens as Richard and John take their turns on the Plantagenet throne.
Welcome back to the final episode of Lion's Forge. My name is Beckett, and I want to tell you a story, an epic true story of 5 kings and the Lion Queen. Season 3, Episode 17, Lackland. With Lionheart's stunning death, it was now John Lackland's turn. This prince, who had done everything he could think of to take the center of the magnificent board, at last had found his way there in the simple course of life and death. And so it was that he spoke the oaths of coronation at Westminster and bared himself to the Archbishop of Canterbury to be anointed with the sacred oil on his head, his chest, and his hands. The golden crown, so heavy that 2 earls had to help support his neck, rested on his head. He swore reverence toward God and the Church, commitment to justice for his people, and determination to root out bad laws. He would sign his charters, John, by the grace of God, King of England, Lord of Ireland, Duke of Normandy and Aquitaine, Count of Anjou. It's said that 21 prime oxen were slaughtered by the royal butchers for the coronation feast. He had become the greatest monarch in Western Europe. It was John Lackland's misfortune to follow in the footsteps of a king as magnificently kingly as Richard Lionheart. Such a Plantagenet in his energy, ambition, courage, and pure charisma. John would eventually whine that everything unlucky has happened to me. And it has to be said that he had a point. Richard inherited the throne cleanly from his failing, unpopular father, while John became king in the midst of people's stunned horror at Lionheart's incomprehensible death. The boy-nephew, Arthur of Brittany, had been no threat to Richard. But he was a very real threat to John, since many men felt Arthur rightfully outranked John in terms of the succession. The cunning, aggressive French could be faced down with confidence, as long as Richard the Invincible Warrior was in charge. But people were far less trusting when John commanded the army. Then, too, John's majestic brother had left massive debts behind, and had already taxed every man, every ox, every farm, and every abbey to the point where the screws seemingly could not be turned any tighter. The man who then twists them another quarter turn makes people scream. Even John's body couldn't measure up. He grew to a normal height for his time, but it left him probably a full foot shorter than his towering, battle-toughened 6'5" brother, who'd be an impressive physical specimen even today. There's a medieval rendering of our new king which even now can make you laugh. The little inked figure perches on his uncomfortable throne, crown precariously sliding off his head to the vicinity of his left eyebrow. No wonder one brother was known to the world as Lionheart, while the other was forever saddled with Lackland. He does have his defenders here and there, particularly in more recent years, although they've always been pretty thin on the ground. People willing to give him the benefit of the doubt point to his intelligence, that notable Plantagenet family trait, and to his initial interest in good governance, even if such interest became increasingly episodic in practice. He wasn't lazy, at least not at the beginning. He was a refined prince, the first in his notoriously casual male line credited with keeping a household that he liked to see well-fed, well-dressed, and well-mannered. It was said that he regularly bathed himself in scented water, kept tailors and jewelers busy, and ordered things like 4,000 pottery plates and 400 yards of linen for the innovative napkin. He's even credited with the first royal order for sugar in England. Like his father, he cared about having an orderly kingdom, at least before his personality veered off into the almost entirely pathological. As a new king, he vigorously took the chancery in hand, regulating what had become the unconscionable fees people were charged to get almost anything done. Dyers, those tricksters, were now watched over by the king's officers, an early consumer protection initiative. John also agreed to set prices for the best wines from Poitou and Anjou, although this innovation quickly yielded the unintended consequence of a great many happy English drunks. He encouraged the building of towns. Liverpool was his creation, launched on his lands. People were coaxed to settle there by exempting them from many of the taxes of the day. Historians also point with smiles to the carefully copied and dated royal documents that were a trademark of John's reign, in marked contrast to the prior practice of often not bothering to write things down at all. A good many English sheep gave their lives, so the king's chancery could make tidy parchment records of the orders of the day. Along those same lines, John took great interest, as his father had done, in the judicial system. He liked to sit with royal judges as they heard even trivial cases, and would readily go to the realm's legal experts for advice on more difficult questions. If a case was important enough, and the king unavoidably absent, the judges would carefully make a marginal reminder to discuss the case with him. Even in wartime, not his strongest suit, he was smart and energetic enough to impose embargoes on things like English wheat and wool that strong-armed wavering allies back into the Plantagenet fold. He also inherited an England that was poised for a great century. In the 1200s, it would more than double in population. People marveled at windmills, a wonderful new invention that lifted brutish labor from the backs of men and animals. Churches in the exciting vertical style imported from the French, stone walls open to God's light, were rising from new foundations. Silver had been discovered in Allied Germany. Once mined and minted, there were more convenient silver coins to trickle through men's hands. Mining and minting, in turn, gave people new ways to make a living. So did brickmaking, the new fashion that was gaining on old-time stonework. Trade was becoming a new ticket to wealth. Selling English wool to Flanders weavers was a lovely business, with Flemish money circulating back through the ranks of eager English merchants, weavers, and sheep shearers. Trade and money mixed well. There were 350 formal markets in the country by now, 150 exciting annual trade fairs that drew international visitors. The Channel ports boomed. All of this meant more people doing more things that needed to be recalled with particularity. Some experts believe that painstaking medieval calligraphy, each letter carefully and separately formed, used for centuries by monks and officials to write things down, was too slow for the burst of governmental and commercial work that had to get done in this bustling new era. Pressured clerks started using a simpler style that would come to be called cursive, the flowing letter-join-to-letter writing we use ourselves when we aren't typing. For that matter, there were so many documents to be sealed that more wax was needed, making beekeeping a profession to aspire to. In short, John was blessed with intelligence and much good fortune. Unfortunately, it's always been the other side of his character that puts paid to any idea of being transported back to the early 13th century and becoming friends with John Lackland. By the time he's dead and buried in 1216, he will have lost virtually all Plantagenet holdings in France, alienated rock-solid allies, been credibly suspected of murder, made a reckless, disastrous marriage, and been avaricious enough that simple resentment among his subjects flamed into a civil war that ended with some of his barons offering the English crown to the French prince, Philip Augustus's son. John's evil cruelty became the stuff of legend, mined for its drama centuries after his death. Shakespeare defined John for generations to come as scheming, devious, and weak. We all know the Robin Hood story, where the hero of Sherwood Forest grapples with the evil Sheriff of Nottingham and the sheriff's greedy, tyrannical Lord John, while Richard Lionheart is on crusade. There was real truth in it. The pipe rolls, the English government's careful tally of monies due and settled, testify to so-and-so paying simply to, as the document said, abate the king's ill will. This king's ill will was no minor thing. In the worst cases, it would wreck an entire family, generations of dynastic effort crippled. To be fair to John, men had also paid to calm his father's and brother's notoriously flammable tempers. But not so often, and not so much. If John was in a really bad mood, the distressed nobleman had to sign what amounted to a mortgage on his estates. In later years, typically suspicious that he might be cheated, John started demanding human hostages as collateral, a source of bitterness that bled across generations. You were never entirely sure where you stood, since John loved playing ends against the middle. He'd impose heavy fines on errant lords, and then weeks or months or years later could arbitrarily forgive the debt, which forced indebted barons to swallow their bile and pay obsequious homage to their king. Given so much at stake, a great many powerful men were fawning to John's face while making themselves scarce the rest of the time. William Marshall, an esteemed Plantagenet stalwart, saw fit to spend a good deal of time in Ireland after John took the throne. What made him who he was? There's no objective way to compare 12th century parenting to our own, but it's not hard to feel that John was shortchanged in terms of childhood nurturing. He was placed at Fontevraud, possibly with his 5-year-old sister Joan, when he was scarcely 2. Why these 2 Plantagenet children were housed there has never been adequately explained. They would live at the abbey for some 5 years, and by the time they came out, their mother would be spending the next decade or so in prison. Henry Plantagenet took his youngest son away from Fontevraud when the boy was 6. Life after that was spent largely with his father, a man notorious for his dislike of routine, the very thing that children crave. It wasn't the warmest or most secure of childhoods, even in the tough world of medieval parenting, and it evidently left him at a chilly distance from other people. If human nature follows any logical path of cause and effect, John never learned to trust because he had little experience of security in his own young life. Lacking loyalty himself, he was sure he saw looming disloyalty in everyone else. He didn't know how one might counter it peacefully, so his only response was a dogged determination to ferret it out before it hurt him. One of his biographers details the elaborate checks he put in place throughout his government to prevent being tricked, cheated, or disobeyed, with multiple men assigned to the same job so everyone could keep an eye on each other. Even being a longtime John supporter didn't really protect you. He developed the ugly habit of turning on loyalists who'd served him and his family in peace and war for years, his mind suddenly tormented by the conviction they could no longer be trusted. A mere 10 years had passed since Henry II's death. He had spent his life, his prodigious energy, and his spectacular luck creating an empire woven from the strands of half a dozen dynasties that came before him, from Scotland, from Anjou, from the Aquitaine, from Normandy and Brittany, Ireland, and England. Richard had held it and pushed out into the Mediterranean. Now everything depended on John. That little man slumped on his throne, his crown skewed over one eye, halfway to falling onto the unforgiving stone floor. Like his father and his brother, he'd be pitted against Philip Augustus, veteran of the Siege of Acre, not to mention 20 years in the trenches against Henry II and Richard Lionheart. The Capets and the Plantagenets would go at each other in France's midsection, vying particularly for control of Normandy, the Plantagenet stronghold. John had to hold Normandy. The Normans themselves had always been tough and self-willed, drifting between allegiances to the Dukes of Normandy, one of the titles dearest to the Plantagenets, and the French king. The Eastern Normans, close to Paris, tended to be more Capetian in their sympathies, while their brethren to the south and west were more likely to back the Plantagenets. Philip Augustus, with his ambitions for the French crown, had wanted to muscle his way further across Normandy's borders for years, something that had given even Lionheart nightmares. Now, mighty Richard was dead, and Philip would face off against Lionheart's brother, a man saddled in his own day with the savagely mocking nickname Lackland. John was publicly supported by his powerfully intimidating mother. She was a tough old woman, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Perhaps she hadn't cherished the child John, but the adult John was her son, and her sons were kings. She saw to his coronation as she had seen to Richard's, and then took herself off to the other side of the Channel, where she'd spend the rest of her life. She'd go to Fontevraud by way of half a dozen Aquitanian cities loyal to her, taking care that they pledged themselves to her last boy. But there was still the fact that even though John had been named heir to the Plantagenet throne by Richard on his deathbed, the law of succession, now so boringly well settled, was still in flux in 1199. John was Henry Plantagenet's fourth legitimate son to survive to adulthood, behind young Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey. Geoffrey had died in Paris all those years before, but if he had lived, everyone agreed he would have succeeded Richard as king. A great many people now thought that Geoffrey's son Arthur, not John, should be the new king. For that matter, Richard himself had named Arthur his heir back in those dramatic days in Sicily, even though he changed his mind at the end. While the English and the Normans loyally tended to favor John's claim to the Plantagenet Empire, the Angevins, the Scots, and particularly the Bretons preferred young Arthur. Arthur was still only a 12-year-old boy, but his grandmother Eleanor had held the sworn fealty of the Aquitaine when she had been his age. It was true that Arthur had troubling ties to Philip Augustus, but he'd yet had no opportunities to make the kind of mistakes men took a dislike to. To round out John's troubles, his own heirs, that essential next generation, were missing. Despite having spent most of his life with Isabel of Gloucester, Lackland had no children, which gave nephew Arthur another route to the throne. In truth, John had problems enough that even intelligence and good fortune might sink under the weight of belligerence allied with mistrust. It was a potent stew. The Plantagenet-Capetian Wars, which had gone on for 2 generations by now, continued, spreading wreckage across villages and farms, interrupting trade and costing money. John had adopted his brother's expensive reliance on mercenaries rather than pledged knights. Mercenaries weren't cheap. Simply manning the castles that guarded all those hundreds of miles of Plantagenet borderlands was a vast expense. John's finances were further pressed by his brother's ghost. Richard had taxed and borrowed everything he could, thanks to his crusade, his own endless battles in France, Chateau Gaillard, and his ransom. Plantagenet revenues were already tight. When a king needed money in the year 1200, there were few ways to get it, and John leaned heavily on them all. Taxes rose. Monasteries were taxed. Jews were bled white. The laws carrying cash penalties multiplied, and the fines that accompanied them doubled and doubled again. So did the fees that had to be paid for a royal nod in the direction of an ambitious man who wanted an official position. So did the levies due to the crown upon coming into an inheritance, which saddled the wealthiest and most powerful families, not the people you'd want to view your rule with generational bitterness. Then there were the forestry laws, which affected more than just the rich. John was passionate about hunting and hawking. Eagles and falcons, deer and wild boar all needed space. So John declared entire swaths of England royal forests, where only the king could hunt. It didn't matter who had legally owned the lands yesterday. As of today, they were within the king's sole right. All of Essex was inside the arbitrary border, as were great reaches of Hampshire and Wiltshire. One contemporary said angrily that John afforested all of England. Once set aside for the king, no one else could hunt so much as a partridge on those lands, much less cut timber, grow crops, graze animals, put up a fence, or rent or sell the property, even if it had been in your family for generations. Other forces were abroad in the world as well. A major tournament south of Paris in November 1199 attracted the flower of the aristocracy, who devoted many hours to discussions of Pope Innocent's renewed call for a new crusade, to finish what Richard Lionheart had left undone, the retaking of Jerusalem. A great many tournament guests decided they'd rather crusade and save their souls than worry about John Lackland's military needs. Still, thoughtful men were weighing news that the Germans and the Church had come out in favor of John's rights over Arthur's. Even Philip Augustus was cautious at first. The French king had his own problems. He remained mired in a years-long struggle with Rome, thanks to his passionately stubborn preference for his beloved Agnes of Moravia over his legitimate second wife, Ingeborg of Denmark. The obstinate Dane never agreed to an annulment, but Philip had married Agnes in 1196 anyway. The king was thus left to bob and weave for the better part of 4 years to avoid personal excommunication and national interdict. Philip would sullenly promise to set Agnes aside, only to find he couldn't bear to part with her. The births of 2 Agnes-born babies, including a much-desired second son, didn't make things easier. Philip, publicly pressured by Rome, which ultimately excommunicated him and slapped interdict on France, and John, privately pressured by his kingdom's wobbly finances, were essentially forced to put an end to the decades of Plantagenet-Capetian quarreling. The two sides assembled their nobles, their knights, their bishops, and their clerks in May at a quiet little riverside village on the Seine, called Le Goulet. There, as chief counselors leaned forward with their kingdom's great seals, the king signed a truly significant peace treaty. It swapped Philip's acknowledgement of John as King of England and ruler of Plantagenet lands in France for John's recognition of Philip as his overlord on the continent. Arthur, John's rival, was left out, with nothing but Brittany. Having publicly made himself Philip's vassal, John accepted all the responsibilities of a liegeman, including promises to attend Philip's court when summoned, and to supply troops to help Philip with his wars. The Treaty of La Goulet had set troublesome Arthur aside, but never before had a Plantagenet king agreed to acknowledge a Frenchman as his overlord. Nor had the treaty simply made peace. It also wanted to make love. The day after it was signed, there was a Plantagenet-Capetian wedding, that favored medieval sign of supposed abiding peace. The groom would be Philip's son and heir, Louis, 13, ripe to be betrothed. The stumbling block this time was that there was no equivalent royal Plantagenet princess. John had never had children with Isabel of Gloucester. No matter, there were other eligible Plantagenet girls, daughters of the royal family of Castile, where John's sister Eleanor had long been queen. The family matriarch, Eleanor of Aquitaine, now in her mid-70s, took it upon herself to personally escort her granddaughter through the Alps to France. This little girl, known to history as Blanche of Castile, became Prince Louis's bride and lifelong mate, linking the Capets to the Plantagenets at last. Perhaps it was the sight of love blooming anew in that first May of a new century that triggered the thought in John's head that it was time for another wedding, this time his own. John's relationships with women generally were not of the tenderly romantic school. He fathered a brood of bastards. He's definitely credited with 5, while some genealogists claim 12. Several of the most belligerent rebel barons of John's later reign claimed to have been deeply wronged by Lackland's aggressive pilfering of their women. By the spring of 1200, John had recently parted ways with his barren first wife, Isabel of Gloucester, after 12 years of matrimony. They had no children, and Isabel was suspiciously agreeable to the annulment John won from some compliant bishops. But even though the annulment freed him, John's situation was messy. In his early 30s, he needed a legitimate heir, and he needed one quickly, given that many of his subjects thought Arthur of Brittany a perfectly acceptable, even preferable, alternative. There are records that he sent a delegation to Portugal in search of a new wife, but it turned out that no princess from Lisbon would sit beside him. Without even warning his startled ambassadors to flee what was about to become a very frosty Portuguese court, John suddenly veered off in an entirely new and ultimately disastrous direction. His next wife was to be a singularly inappropriate lady, Isabella of Angoulême. Angoulême, deep in the heart of the Aquitaine, was historically one of the most notoriously treacherous holdings in the Plantagenet Empire. Lionheart had fought rebels there most of his life. He was fighting there when he died. The two most powerful local lords, Angoulême and Lusignan, had often blatantly allied themselves with the kings of France. However, Plantagenet-Lusignan relations mellowed during the Third Crusade, and there's evidence that Richard himself engineered a betrothal between the Angoulême heiress Isabella, already considered a staggering beauty despite being little more than a child, and Hugh Lusignan, the ninth of his line, who was in his 30s at the time and contemplating his second marriage. Isabella was unquestionably a spectacular heiress. In addition to her stunning looks, she was Philip Augustus's cousin, a direct descendant of both French and English monarchs, blood linked to the kings of Hungary, Aragon, Castile, and Jerusalem, related to the nobility of Constantinople, and kin to half the royal courts of Europe. She was so well connected that her family tree, with all its interlocking lines and arrows, looks like a parody. Her rights to territory in the heart of France, desperately sought by both Plantagenets and Capets, made her a priceless addition to any family. Her father's lands, eventually to be hers and her husband's, controlled the very center of continental Plantagenet territory. The Lusignans had scored a bride who combined every one of the most admired attributes of a medieval wife. She was young, gorgeous, brimming with promised fertility, impeccably noble, very rich, and strategically invaluable. But Isabella did not marry a Lusignan. Instead, she married none other than John Lackland. The specifics of John's sudden marriage to this goddess are cloudy. We're not sure how old Isabella was when things began to move with speed in 1200. Most historians calculate that she was not more than 15, and quite possibly as young as 9, which made her some 20 years younger than either Hugh Lusignan or John Lackland. Some historians believe Isabella hadn't yet married Hugh. Others think they were in fact married, but believe that Isabella's youth had caused her husband to courteously delay bedding her, leaving the marriage unconsummated. Whatever had occurred between Hugh and Isabella, John somehow managed to engineer his own marriage to the delectable heiress in the late summer of the year 1200, and saw to it that she was crowned and anointed Queen of England. The Lusignans, robbed, were furious, a sorry end to what had been newfound friendship between the Plantagenets and one of their most notoriously rebellious dynasties. As for the scandalous marriage, it didn't do all that well as the years passed. There was gossip that John at first could scarcely bring himself to leave Isabella's bed. If you believe that Isabella was merely a girl when she married, the marriage looks very ugly. Although, as with most marriages, it's hard to tell what was going on. Their first child, a boy who would eventually become England's King Henry III, wasn't born for 7 years. The couple ultimately had 5 children and would remain married to each other until John died in 1216. But within a few years of their wedding, a chronicler wrote, "He hates her and she hates him." It's said they both became spitefully active adulterers. She was openly suspected of sleeping with a half-brother, and it's said John was ultimately driven to dangling the corpse of one of Isabella's lovers from the ceiling above his bewitching wife's bed. The gossip all of this generated did nothing to blot out John's lifelong reputation as thoughtless and weak. People who had reason to wonder if he deserved their allegiance took it all in. As for the Lusignans, furious though they were, it seems that they held themselves steady at first, no doubt thinking the Plantagenet king would do right by them, paying them gold or turning over territory for the girl. They failed to recognize that John never paid anyone for anything if he could conceivably avoid it. In this case, he outdid himself, adding insult to injury by promising Isabella 2 rich holdings that should have gone toward mollifying the Lusignans. The family, thwarted at John's hands, turned east and laid its case in front of the other great power in their world, Philip Augustus. Philip's initial comment on the Lusignan matter was to ask that John give the Lusignans a fair chance to present their demands for recompense. Principals of the Lusignan family attended Lackland's court as agreed, but found themselves the defendants in a trial for old treasons against the Plantagenets, rather than as the plaintiffs in their own case of the stolen Isabella. They took an appeal back to Philip, newly acknowledged again as their liege lord. As such, Philip was obliged to see to it that his vassals got justice. Philip's first move was to contact his fellow king, reminding him that Lackland was obliged by custom to give the Lusignans a fair hearing. John in turn did what John often did, which was lie about his intentions, motives, and methods. He'd set up new hearings, but switched locales at the last minute or neglected to send the Lusignans a safe conduct so they might reach his court in peace. When they didn't risk the trip, John made it out to Philip that they had refused to attend. There was no immediate response from the French. Philip bided his time. The calendar slowly circled round to Easter 1202. Philip now bore down on the Lusignan matter, although at first it didn't seem all that ominous. He simply sent a demand for John's presence in Paris to settle the thing. By the terms of both feudal obligations and the Treaty of Le Goulet, John was obliged to attend this liege lord. He didn't. Instead, he returned a haughty and overly clever reply that as the Duke of Normandy, he could not be compelled to attend the French court in Paris. The Duke was only due at courts held in the Norman border. Philip pounced. He replied that he had summoned John as the Duke of the Aquitaine, not the Duke of Normandy. Now, there was no way for John to dodge Philip. If John appeared, he'd put himself in Philip's hands. But if he avoided that trap, Philip had him dead to rights as a disobedient vassal. Given two equally unappetizing options, John chose what he believed to be the safer thing. He did nothing. And so it was that all hell broke loose for the Plantagenets in France. At the very end of it, still decades in the future, but coming, the ancient French lands of the Plantagenets would be gone. English kings confined to their British islands for another 400 years. French forces, led by 15-year-old Arthur to the south and Philip to the north, started across the Plantagenet borders. Eleanor of Aquitaine, nearly 80 years old and in poor health, emerged from her semi-retirement in Fontevraud to rally the Aquitanians at Poitiers. She was in the fortress of Mirbeau at the time, where her grandson Arthur found her. The grand old lady got a message through to John that she was facing a siege. For once, John was a warrior like his brother. He got his army 80 miles to Mirbeau in 48 hours. Not only had his men marched like veritable lightning, they won the fight that followed, hitting hard just before dawn, taking 2 Lusignan lords along with an even greater prize, Arthur of Brittany. It was Lackland's greatest battlefield success. And John was about to throw it all away. A key ally who'd been invaluable in raising the Mirbeau siege was William de Rocher. At first, grateful Lackland promised that de Rocher would manage Arthur's ransom, but within hours, John instead snatched Arthur up himself. He may have belatedly realized that de Rocher, with Arthur in hand, would be a kingmaker to be reckoned with, and instantly concluded he didn't trust him. Not having seen that in the first place had been thoughtless. Not quickly announcing a soothing sweetener for de Rocher, a new title, a castle somewhere, money, a wealthy new bride, was stupid. Going back on his word was disastrous. De Rocher headed off to Paris to kneel before Philip Augustus. On the way, he collected other men who saw John as he did. John had single-handedly managed to see to it that men who lived in the very center of Plantagenet lands on the continent, men who would have loyally stood at his brother's shoulder, now pledged themselves to the King of France. Within a year, fortresses across Plantagenet lands were toppling. It was whispered that the king all but hid under the covers, refusing to leave his wife's bed, fearful of ambush on his own roads. The stresses on such a weak man, multiplying by the day, had to be the worst he had ever experienced. There was no powerful father or brother to forgive him, solve the problems, turn the tide. Perhaps those stresses, building and building, pushed him over the line that marks human behavior, for many believed then, and many have believed ever since, that John had his captive nephew, Arthur of Brittany, murdered on Holy Thursday, the 3rd of April, 1203, in the midst of all the turmoil of those days. One whispered story was that he was shoved off a cliff into the Channel. No one ever saw him again. His corpse, assuming there was a corpse, was never found. Arthur's unexplained absence became muttered certainty. First, that he was dead, and ultimately that he was dead because his uncle had caused it. Given the lack of any proof, it took years. But Arthur's death would come to be laid at John's door just as Becket's had been laid at Henry's. The key difference was that while everyone knew Becket had died, they also knew Henry hadn't actually put his own hands on him. No one would swear that same oath about John and Arthur, as whispered stories circulated across Europe. Historians tend to think that by now John was shell-shocked. The ugly unwinding of his empire was picking up speed. Richard had controlled because no one had the slightest expectation he'd fail. John foundered in part because few expected he'd succeed. Some men believed they saw a king who had killed the boy Arthur and deserved no loyalty. Others saw a king going down and fled from him before he could take them down too. The king became weaker. The weaker he became, the more men he lost. One study in our day found 38 former Plantagenet nobles who decamped to the French, and even this astonishing number may have been no more than a fraction of the whole. John made no effort to rally the supporters he had left. Those who watched him saw nothing but a frightened man dodging his own terrors as he skulked away, telling his own people he'd be at one place while heading instead to another so he couldn't be waylaid, wouldn't be trapped. Lackland did make one last effort to pull himself together. In January of 1204, John called a council of his barons in Oxford, his backbone apparently stiffened by a month away from the endless struggles on the far side of the Channel. A good number of the men who sat in that chilly room to hear him held lands in France, and were ready to fight to get them back. But just as John was about to leave for Normandy, word reached him that Richard's magnificent fortress Gaillard had fallen. It meant that Rouen, the heart of invaluable Normandy, itself the heart of the Plantagenet Empire, was completely exposed to Philip Augustus. Gaillard gone, Lackland sent word to those barons who still cared about what he said that he had no thought any longer of supporting Plantagenet lands on the continent. They could expect no help from him. There would be struggles by English kings, including John later in his reign, and John's son, to reclaim Normandy in particular. They all failed. France would come to win it all. And in that fated spring of 1204, Eleanor of Aquitaine died in her 80th year. The day was either a Wednesday, March 31st, or Thursday, April 1st. Another day in another of the springs that time after time had brought incalculable change to her changeable life. Carl Sandburg wrote a poem hundreds of years later that seems perfectly fit for that early spring day in the year 1204.
White pigeons rush at the sun, a marathon of wing feats is on. Who most loves danger? Who most loves wings? Who somersaults for God's sake in the sun and blue on an April Thursday?
And so we come to the end of our telling of the first Plantagenets, people whose brilliant histories of births, deaths, marriages, murders, crusades, bravery, cowardice, lust, and innocence still pull us into their drama centuries after they strode across the stage. We've so enjoyed bringing them to you, and hope to be back before too long with another series on later kings living their own tumultuous lives. Thank you for taking this journey with us. Myself, Beckett Arnold, narrator, with assistance from Francis Butt. The story and scripts were written by Karen Markle-Knabb from her book Lion's Forge, the epic story of 5 kings and the Lioness Queen. And I will be back in December with another story from Karen Markle-Knabb, this time a Christmas story called The Raindrop Tree, available everywhere you get your favorite podcasts. Once again, I am Beckett Arnold. Thank you for listening.